My name is Brigitte Nollet, and I am the General Manager for Roche Pharmaceuticals, representing Belgium and Luxembourg.
Il est 16 heures.
I am delighted to host today's roundtable and to see such a diverse audience. Being a Canadian living and working in Belgium, one of the things that I have learned is how important the life sciences and health sector are in Belgium. I have been struck by the level and the quality of research, from bench research to clinical trials to partnership developments. And I've been impressed with the number of biotech pharmaceutical companies that exist here, and even as members of pharma.be. You are well known as a pharma valley. And they exist because of the smart and capable researchers, because of a strong education system, a mindset that welcomes new innovation and new medicines, and because you have, at least up until now, governmental and hospital policies that have encouraged research to blossom. These are my observations, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from our speakers today to know their observations and what are the conditions for success for innovation into the future. During COVID, we saw more than ever the importance of research and partnerships to come together in a thoughtful and efficient way. And it is an area where we should all be proud. Belgium has played such an important role on the European scene, on the world scene, in terms of the development of diagnostics, vaccines, research into medicines to fight COVID. And another interesting development throughout this past year and a half has been the interest that people have taken to learn more about the development of medicines, the development of vaccines. And at least in the 15 years that I've been in the industry, this is a really important time where there are questions, there is interest, and there's a willingness to learn that I've never seen before. And we think it's wonderful and a great opportunity to really dive in and explain our industry, our ability, our willingness to partner and to continue to bring more research to those in need. And that is what today is all about. It's about learning. So we are very happy to have a top panel of experts who have come together to discuss the importance of innovation and the conditions for success now and into the future. We have 4 opinion leaders from very different perspectives who will discuss the impact of innovation on the health sector, the pharmaceutical industry, and the broader framework necessary to continue. Now, before we go into the talks, I just have a few housekeeping rules. The first is to let you know that this roundtable is being recorded. The second is to let you know that at the very end, there will be a poll, and we are just looking for your feedback at the very end so that we understand what you've enjoyed from today's conversation and how we can continue to improve into the future. In terms of our agenda, each speaker will cover a specific element of today's topic for approximately 10 minutes. And after that 40 minutes, we will follow that with a Q&A panel discussion. So please, your questions are very welcome. You will see a Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, this Q&A icon. Please submit your questions. We will include as many of them as possible during that panel discussion. And if we do not have sufficient time to answer them all, we will make sure we follow up individually. So with that, I want to thank our 4 speakers. We have with us Professor Goldman from the Université Libre de Bruxelles. We have Professor Wattenberg from the Solvay Business School. We have Mrs. Caroline Vin, who is the CEO of pharma.be. And we have Professor De Backer, who is CEO of R&D with Catholic University Leuven. And let me start with you, Professor De Backer, if you would allow me just to provide a few introductory remarks of your biography before we get started. So Professor De Backer is a multi-award-winning professor and has been with KU Leuven since 1995. He obtained his PhD in management from the University of Kent, and he was a Fulbright Hays postdoctoral fellow at MIT. He has been an invited professor and lecturer in the area of innovation management in various academic institutions, from an academic MBA, PhD, and executive programs such as Manchester School of Business, INSEAD, Milano Politecnico, Tilburg University, and Chalmers University. He has been a promoter and recipient of various research grants in the areas of research management and innovation policy. Since 2001, he is the promoter, coordinator of the Expert Center for R&D monitoring of the Flemish government. And since 1999, Professor De Backer is actively engaged in technology transfer as Managing Director of KU Leuven Research and Development and Chairman of the Gemma Frisius Fund of the KU Leuven. He is the co-founder and chairman of Leuven Inc., the innovation network of Leuven high-tech entrepreneurs. And since last year, he is the chair of KBC Group, KBC Bank, and KBC Insurance, alongside his continuing responsibilities with KU Leuven Research and Development. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today to share your views, and the virtual floor is now yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brigitte. Always forget that I should unmute, so that's done now. So thank you for the kind introduction. As you mentioned, my background is a bit broader than just the pharmaceutical industry, which means that I'm not going to go in depth in the life science area, but I'm going to try to give an overview as to what it means to turn R&D into purposeful innovation. And if you can go to the next slide, please. The first important point I want to make and share is the fact that, taking the perspective of a university, we should never forget that the prime mission of a university is to advance the frontier of scientific knowledge. And I've just put up a few pictures here to really show what it means. So Alfred von Harnack is a German scientist who is really the inspirational founder of the Max Planck Institutes. And till this very day, the Max Planck Institutes built both their scientific and innovation activity on the concept of curiosity-driven research at the initiative of the individual scientist. And this has been shown to change the frontiers of knowledge, as Vannevar Bush, the advisor to President Eisenhower, who wrote a very influential report in 1945, being the Science, the Endless Frontier as a title. And you also see, for instance, the ITER fusion reactor, which is being built in Cadarache in south of France. So this to show that science is at the foundation of everything we do when we talk about transfer, when we talk about translating knowledge into application, both societal and economical. And this brings me to the next slide, because the next slide really gives us an overview of the innovation model as it has developed over the last 2 centuries. 19th century, we had a very entrepreneurial model, and you see a person like Thomas Alva Edison, who is one of the iconic inventors and innovators in the United States, alongside people like Nikola Tesla and other ones. In the second half of the 20th century, well, mid-20th century, we have seen the rise of the large corporate R&D center. Think of Bell Labs, think of the laboratories of Imperial Chemical, think of Philips NatLab closer to home. And instead of being just entrepreneurial driven, we see that innovation becomes a corporate matter. It's integrated within the large corporate laboratory, which becomes the in-house R&D center for groups like Philips and other ones. And today, 21st century, we see that this model has been augmented and is changing again. It's not just entrepreneurial anymore, it's not just corporate anymore, but it's distributed. It's a model, we call it triple helix, sometimes we call it quadruple helix, and quadruple helix is extremely relevant to the life science and the pharmaceutical area, where we have knowledge institutes, universities, public research centers, large government programs. I think of the Innovative Medicines Initiative and the Innovative Health Initiative in Europe, and companies, large corporates, small startups, there wouldn't have been many vaccines around in the COVID area and era if we wouldn't have had the collaborations between small life science, biotech on the one hand, and large corporate pharmaceutical on the other hand. And fourth, but not least, we see an increasing involvement of patient groups of what we call the quadruple helix, civil society, in helping to set the course of action, translating science into innovation. So today we have entered the realm of distributed innovation, and in distributed innovation settings, we have a collaborative model that has come to the forefront. But next slide, please. This also means that there has been quite some research showing how the interaction between, on the one hand, technical change and economic progress, the publication by Robert Solow that won him the Nobel Prize in the 80s. But we also see in recent research published in Science, for instance, that patents and publications, technology and science are increasingly intertwined. A huge study of 32 million articles in the Web of Science by the authors cited here as part of their science report shows that about 80% of those publications are today integrated into the patent literature with 1, 2, 3 citations. So this means that there is an interaction between science and technology that can also be measured using data, using patent data and publication data. And at the bottom of the graph, at the bottom of the slide, you see how universities and industry really complement one another in terms of their research and innovation activities. Basic research on the one hand, the blue curve, development activities on the other hand, the green curve. So this is reality. Science, innovation, market have become extremely interdependent. And this brings me to the next slide. The next slide showing that we have to organize for this. And those are just a number of scientific inventions, discoveries and inventions that after a couple of years have been brought to market from the Leuven research base. For instance, one of the products, the Viriat products, are the tenofovir molecules that are very active agents to help to support patients with HIV. So science and innovation, they are two dancers, sometimes dancing on a different rhythm, but definitely complementing one another. And this brings me to the next slide. The next slide showing that this can take time. In order to do so, in order to support this activity, we have to understand that time doesn't forgive if you don't take time into consideration. And this is a nice example on the life science biotech industry, going back to its origins in 45 with people, researchers, scientists like Max Delbrück, who were on a quest for physical laws unique to biology. And then you had Watson, Crick, and Franklin. Then you had Paul Burke and colleagues. Then you had Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier and David Liu, who all have brought the frontier of scientific knowledge forward. And in the meantime, in parallel, we see that there are hundreds of listed biotechs, hundreds of billions of dollars of turnover, and hundreds of thousands of jobs that were created. This was 2018. Today, we can be sure that those numbers are outdated and should be doubled at least. So, but understanding timelines, bringing science to innovation to market takes sufficient time. And that's something, even in COVID era, we have to take this into account. And the enormous breakthrough in vaccine development has been possible thanks to the preparedness and the competence base that was already available both at the corporate side and at the academic side. And this brings me to the next slide, because this means that once you want to engage in effective knowledge transfer, an effective collaboration and purposeful collaboration between academia and industry, you have to understand that platforms are needed. Platform organizations where science, technology, the right organizational approach towards an ecosystem development think about the patient groups I was referring to, and a value network, combining the value of small biotech and large corporate pharmaceuticals or pharmaceutical corporates. The ingredients are needed to be combined in order to support really true novel market creating innovations. And that's what we've seen in vaccine development. That's also what I call meeting in the middle. That's why you need platforms like the Center for Drug Discovery and Drug Design, or like the Pharmaps platform that we have created over the last 10, 15 years, in order to cover and to bridge the gap between, on the one hand, the bench, on the other hand, what happens to the patient, the bed, and on the other hand, still, what companies need to develop to get approved and to bring to market. So a sense of purpose in tech transfer means that we have to build and combine the ingredients of science, technology, organization, value network. And this brings me to the next slide, because this means, and that's just an example of how it works. This, for instance, is the Dutch-Flemish program on regenerative medicine called RegMed XB, RegMed Cross Border. And there you see the different foundations on which the ecosystem is being built. Not just medtech and biotech and big pharma, but also knowledge institutes and universities, healthcare providers, and of course, patient organizations and payers, health insurances. If you want to leverage ecosystems, you have to bring this quadruple helix together. And that's what modern purposeful technology transfer is all about. And it's very real when you go to the pharmaceutical and life science area. And this brings me to my next slide, because the next slide is a concluding slide. It means that today, in bringing science to market, in solving societal and economic problems, we have to connect, we have to exploit and explore, we have to pool and share knowledge, and we have to stack it, building the quadruple helix ecosystems that I was just referring to. And that's by way of conclusion, the brief introduction I wanted to provide in order to make sure that science, innovation, and market meet one another. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor De Baca. I think what a wonderful way to kick us off in terms of that macro perspective. And I took away many important messages in terms of purposeful innovation and that sense of purpose that we must have. You also mentioned, and this was a great learning, the distributed evolution of innovation and the ecosystem that you were just referring to, and how collaboration really is key. And you challenged us not only to think private sector, public sector, but much more beyond that in terms of what are the different elements that must come together. And I loved your point about civil society also taking an active role in innovation as we move forward. You spoke of timelines as well, and that base of competencies that has been invested in and that exists, and the building of science towards the future for both societal and economical gains. So thank you for kicking us off with that wonderful talk. And we will now come to you, Professor Goldman, and I will just introduce you, if you allow me, before we turn the floor to you. Professor Goldman is an MD and PhD and Professor Emeritus at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, where he is the founding president of the I3H, Institute for Interdisciplinary Innovation in Healthcare. He was the first executive director of the European Innovative Medicines Initiative, the IMI. He is the editor-in-chief of Frontiers in Medicine and serves on the boards of the French National Institute of Health and Medical Research, the European Tuberculosis Vaccine Initiative, and the Friends of the Global Fund Europe. He is also a member of the Cancer Mission Assembly of the European Commission and of the leadership group of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. Professor Goldman is a laureate of the Lucien Steinberg Prize, which he shares with Professor Peter Piot, and he is the laureate of the Quinential Prize of the Belgian National Fund of Scientific Research and of the Spinoza Chair at the University of Amsterdam. In 2007, Professor Goldman was awarded the degree of the Doctor Honoris Causa of the University of Lille. It is wonderful to have you with us to continue this conversation, and the virtual floor is now yours. Thank you so much in advance.
Well, thank you so much for having me in this panel. It's really a great pleasure to follow on what Koen de Backer said. Let me start by telling you that for me, the first lesson of the COVID-19 pandemic is that overcoming infectious threats primarily depends on science and innovation. Of course, social distancing, masking, basic hygiene have been very important to limit the damages caused by the COVID-19, but just reflect on where we would be if we would not have identified the virus and its genome within a few weeks after the first cases were identified. And if researchers would not have immediately adapted the technology that they were developing for other disease to have available vaccine candidate for SARS-CoV-2. So how many of us would have predicted at the beginning of 2020 that we would have access today to efficient vaccines and antiviral antibodies? The answer actually is simple. Not only researchers, but also industrialists and policymakers succeeded to quickly move out of their usual comfort zone and to address the challenge. To move out of their comfort zone meant to take unusual risks and to engage in unprecedented collaborative endeavors. For academics, the risk was to shift their research focus, often leaving a productive track to engage in an unknown territory. For universities, startups, and biotech, it was about transferring the technology they own to large companies, with the companies which have the capacity to produce and distribute products at a large scale. And for the large companies, the risk was to divert resources dedicated to profitable products and to massively invest in new infrastructures without any guarantee that at the end, the vaccine will ultimately be effective and will reach the market. Don't forget the regulators and the policymakers. It was about delivering emergency use authorization or conditional authorization, while still facing, we should acknowledge it, some uncertainties regarding efficacy and safety. By and large, every partner in this journey did really a great job by putting what we could consider as the common good at the center of their strategy. Now, regarding the engagement of governments, the US massively invests to support the development and production, not only of vaccines, but I will allude to this later on, to antiviral antibodies, while the European Union focuses on a fair access to the vaccine products for the population of the different member states. I will come back to this European strategy later on. Now, I mentioned crossing borders. Crossing borders means, having the public and private sectors working together, moving, as I said, out of their comfort zone. But crossing borders mean also collaboration across disciplines. And what I mean by multidisciplinarity is not only, virology, immunology, epidemiology. We are all familiar with this discipline, which were at the forefront. I would also like to insist on clinical investigation, and also to include in these multidisciplinary endeavors, to go beyond life science and involving economics and social science in general. And I think that, what Koen de Backer just told us, in the sense, is extremely important. And I think that we need people like Koen to really facilitate this translation so that these products at the end reach first the market, and I would say most importantly, the patients. Now, to produce vaccines is one thing. To get them in the arms of people is another one. And that's another area where we need to cross borders. To tackle vaccine hesitancy, we need those people with expertise, you know, in human behavior, in particular in psychology. And I would like here to emphasize one point which for me is extremely important. To educate people about health, about medicines, starts early on. And I would really recommend to all of you to read these books by Gerd Gigerenzer, a famous psychologist from the Max Planck Institute in Berlin. He wrote a book on, you know, risk savvy. And to be risk savvy should be a priority in our education system, and especially to be risk savvy about our own health. Now, crossing borders means also an integrated vision of public health and precision medicine. And I would like to emphasize here, because for me, we are currently at a turning point. Now that, you know, these things are better controlled in terms of, you know, number of cases, the pandemic seems, at least in our countries, to be, you know, better control, I would say, at least. But now is the time for medicine, medical doctors, medical science to really come again at the forefront. You know, when you are overwhelmed by the pandemic, no choice. You have to take rules that you apply to everyone. Now is the time to change this. We are not all the same. We have different genetic background. We have genetic medical histories. So it means that the way even we should be vaccinated should change. And, you know, this is something which is not always easy to explain and to be understood, especially by our politicians. But I'm deeply convinced that now is the time to have medical doctors and other healthcare workers being much more at the forefront in the fight for the pandemics. And just to give you one example, the question of the third dose of the vaccine, not everyone will need this at the same time. Just to give you another example, monoclonal antibodies against the virus are extremely efficient in preventing the most severe cases, but for a number of reasons, they are only indicated in very selected cases, very selected people at risk. Now, and this will be perhaps my final remark, crossing borders is needed, you know, to take this global responsible approach without which the pandemic will not be overcome. It's really to take a multilateralism approach to give more power to WHO, is to support more strongly organizations like COVAX, which are there to provide access in low and middle income countries. And I think that as Europeans, we must be proud that indeed is at the forefront of the European policy. However, I would like to emphasize that where Europe should be much better is indeed to supporting small, medium-sized enterprise in their innovation effort, but also in the way they collaborate with the big pharmas. And I think that there we have indeed progress to be made to avoid that our best scientists or best spin-off startups don't have to cross the ocean to find their partners to get the financing they need. And finally, I would like to re-emphasize what you said. Belgium is an ideal position in the European Union. We have not only excellent scientists, we have not only excellent startups, but we have also in the different regions of the countries, people like Kuhn and organizations which actually have already demonstrated the capacity to facilitate the transfer of knowledge to finally reach the market. And on this, I will close my remarks and thank you again for your invitation.
Thank you so much. I don't know about all of you watching, but I have so many questions that are coming to mind after these two talks. And I just want to remind you that the Q&A button is open for your questions to come in. What I just heard, Professor Goldman, I heard some really important messages for all of us. You started with unprecedented collaboration as being a key factor in this COVID fight. Not only the public health measures that have been extremely important, but also the importance of research. And you mentioned a variety of partners who have had to come together, including universities, biotech, larger companies, regulators, policymakers, all with a common good at the center of the strategy as being one of the areas to come forward. And then you spent a fair amount of time reminding us about the theme of cross borders, not necessarily the literal cross borders between countries, but the cross borders that we all have to have in terms of our mindset and how we think about the future of research. And you spoke about public and private sectors coming together, but out of their comfort zone, along with multidisciplinary teams crossing borders between the life sciences, economic groups, societal groups, really translating and coming together. You spoke of the importance of precision medicine and of really ensuring that our healthcare practitioners are at the forefront of these conversations as well. And you gave us a few examples in the COVID fight in this vein. And you spoke to the importance of crossing borders from a multilateral approach. You mentioned the importance of COVAX and all of us coming together to support those countries that are still in need, as well as how we might go from a multilateral approach to supporting smaller biotech startups with the funds that they need, with the conditions that they need in order to keep them in Europe and to continue flourishing within Europe and showing not only in Belgium, but in Europe, the type of smart science that exists here. So thank you very much for that talk. It's much appreciated. And please keep your questions coming in. With that, we are going to turn to you, Professor Wattenberg. Now, in terms of my introduction to you, Professor Wattenberg combines the functions of expert in strategy, innovation, and entrepreneurship with those of professor and economic columnist. He studied in Belgium, EU, ULB, and ICHEC, in the Netherlands with an MBA in innovation and entrepreneurship at Tilburg University and TU Eindhoven, as well as in the United States at MIT Sloan and at Harvard Business School, where he received the HBS Rector's Scholarship. Professor Wattenberg has 25 years of experience working with startups, large companies, and public institutions. He is currently Senior Advisor and Innovation Ambassador at EY, Professor at the Solvay Business School and Brussels School of Economics and Management, and Economic Expert for the RTL Group, a daily radio column and news commentary on radio and television, as well as on the 24-hour news channel LN24, LN24, where he hosts the weekly program Les Acteurs de l'Écho. It is a pleasure to have you with us, and we are looking forward to your talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm very honored by being here with you today and speaking right after Koen and Michel. So a little sad to only have 10 minutes because there would be so many things to tell about innovation, but Koen de Backer and Michel Goldman already talked about some major elements. So my overview will be the one of of a generalist, but it will also be the professor of entrepreneurship speaking. Next slide, please. Thank you. So first of all, let me be a little provocative, of course, because there will be a debate and I would like to contribute generating questions for the debate. So innovation, it's not only about R&D, and we must clarify this. Some countries have a very high level of R&D, but it doesn't necessarily translate in the benefits, the direct or indirect value for the society. On the other hand, we have realized, and Koen de Backer has talked about it, that innovation is clearly not reserved to university R&D or even the R&D of large companies. Today, clearly, innovation, it's each of us in the business world, but also in the public world. And it becomes more and more responsibility, both of the public and private sector, to commit themselves to challenge the status quo and consider different types of innovation, incremental innovation, but also radical innovation. And by everyone, it's not just the famous triple and then quadruple helix Koen de Backer was talking about, but really I'm talking about the whole society. So next slide, please. So basically, we have 4 types of innovation. It's a quick reminder. The first one are well known, but I'm really in my daily life, I'm fighting to try to push the companies to go beyond those 2 steps. Very often I work with the 3 horizon of strategy of McKinsey, and today explaining that those 3 horizon of strategy must be really dealt with like with a manager or CEO being ambidextrous. At the same time, thinking about product innovation, process innovation, bringing in radical innovation, and even disruptive innovation. When I'm talking about disruptive innovation, it's really new business model innovation. And today there is a big debate about, a large debate about, beyond the molecules, for example, and this is also, business model innovation. So I would like to have the next slide, please. So clearly innovation depends on the creativity and execution of the entrepreneurs, not only about the R&D. And entrepreneurs are most of the time driven by problems. There are people solving problems in the society. And in fact, the value they create and they capture comes from trying to solve problems of the society and bring, to problems concrete solution and diffusing those solutions. So basically, those innovations are pulled by the problems and also pushed by the technology. And I think if we talk about the pharmaceutical sector today, or the biotech, we are clearly at the crossroad with between being pulled by a problem and pushed by a technology. So if I take next slide, please. If I take some of the major challenges that we face today as a society, aging population, for example, chronic diseases or pollution, technology alone will not be able to solve those societal issues. In fact, the solution and overall the diffusion of those solutions will depend on entrepreneurs with equity providers taking really the risk to launch innovative value proposition. And we are so happy to see that those last 15 or 20 years, with researchers like Sarah Sarasvati, for example, we came up with the effectual entrepreneurship. We have learned that today entrepreneurship is a process, and innovative entrepreneurship is a process, and that if we are able to explain and teach this process, we increase the capacity to those companies to succeed. We know that there is a way of creating innovative enterprise that guarantee larger chances of success. So I'm clearly convinced that, and I want to convince you that today the solution to those society problems will come from the technology, but also from entrepreneurs, seeing some challenge pushed by the technology, but overall pulled by the problem. So let's ask ourselves the position of Belgium and see the next slide. As you can see on these slides, we are considered in the European studies as strong innovator. But it's a little frustrating to realize that we are just after the innovation leaders, after those 5 countries that trusting the highest ranking in innovation. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we are improving. You see that from 2012, we have increased our position as innovator, and this is of course very appreciable. Next slide. But on the other hand, we see that one of the elements, and today if we talk about quadruple helix, if we talk about the indispensable cooperation between the public and private sector, we also talk about the environment. And if we see those elements, it seems that the innovative environment is decreasing compared to the rest of Europe. but it's not the only issue that we should be taking into consideration if we want to improve the innovation and the benefits of innovation for society. It's also the lower impact of innovation on employment. It doesn't mean that innovation is not creating direct and indirect employment. It means that because of the specificity of Belgium, we are not capturing the fair share of employment that is generated by innovation, and this is clearly a preoccupation that should be addressed, politically speaking, just as the the innovation environment. Next slide, please. So another interesting ranking is, as you can see, it's based on the two tables, and probably that you will take some more time to read those tables. I don't have the time to go in details. What I would like you to remember from those tables is that we are quite good in clustering in Belgium. We are also recognized a very good education environment, and we're not talking about basic education, where I could certainly say a few words and I would not speak as positively, but regarding the postgrad, regarding the the high quality of the educated students, university students, and also the IP that we are able to generate, we are scoring quite well. And this is mentioned on a regular basis on the study that EY does on the foreign investors, for example. On the other side, we are also not good at seizing opportunities regarding the designing and producing application. It means that if we are quite good on coming up with solution, we are not the best one being able to industrialize and to design very concrete application of those innovation. Next slide, please. So why innovation matters in Belgium? And then allow me, Caroline, to speak a little more about the politics. We are a very small country, so we hear very often that we are hooked to Germany and that we are serving the German industry. What we see in pharmaceutical sector is that this is not really the case. We are really coming up with very great innovation, and we are able in some of the subsector to be very good, like in the vaccines. But most of the time we are still transforming, and we are very much depending on our direct neighbors, France, Netherlands, and Germany. So considering the high employment cost in Belgium and the high level of tax and social contribution, we absolutely need to increase the productivity. So one good reason, first very good reason to really depend on innovation is the need to increase this productivities. And the second one is that innovation should help us to increase the added value of product and services, being able not only to subcontracting from the German market, and this is a cliche, but I want to be a little provocative too, but being able to supply complex and demanding customers with finished products and high technology products and services, without increasing new exporting enterprises and sales, but also without increasing productivity. It's clear that with the aging population, we will not be able to preserve the social model. So innovation should be in the future a major contributor to a society where we can cope with this aging population and the fact that we are still have a very high tax and social contribution. Can I have the next slide, please? So innovation is clearly a public-private partnership. Quadruple helix is a great example of a very strong synergies between the different composition of the society, but also the ecosystem that we have been able to build locally. I think about the different ecosystem in Flanders, but I'm also talking about Charleroi Biotech and so on. The platform that we have been able to launch, the clustering. As we see, we are not that good in creating relationship between small and medium enterprises and large company, but it's really improving from my point of view. And I think that Koen and Michel also mentioned this absolute necessity to work in what we say in French, a filière. The clustering theory of Michael Porter is one thing. Today we see the importance not only to have large companies, but also to have a real network, a value system of subcontractors that can support and be able to quickly bring those innovation on the market. But my conclusion about this slide, and this is the image I wanted to convey, is clearly that we should stop opposing public and private worlds. If you talk about addressing those challenges to innovation, clearly the private and public world have to work together and stop having the impression that one is competing more on one part of the cake. We have to, or challenge today is to let grow the cake. So let me give you an example of a successful successful system platform cluster. Next slide, please. So this is the example of the bio ecosystem in Charleroi. Clearly, we have equipped infrastructures, the great mix of financing, scientific education. This cluster, the biopark, is helping the region to build the necessary capacities to teach students with specific function linked to the biotech. And we have a great example of clustering and the real example of a great filière. And there are other examples. I put Flanders Bio Koen because there are also many examples like this. But we were very proud to see that last year we were welcoming some biotech startups that came from outside of Belgium to join the Charleroi bio clusters. Next slide, please. So the vision I would like to propose in order to feed the debate is clearly fostering the relationship between education and enterprise. This is more important than ever. Foster entrepreneurship mindset in education. We are still lagging behind, and even if it's getting better, I take the example of Solvay, but I take also the example of HEC in Liège. In our business school, the minor that is the most attractive for the new students is entrepreneurship, but it's not enough. We have to keep developing this entrepreneurship a mindset, not only in the education but also in research. We would like to have more researchers that are interested to come up with solutions and not only interested by the technology. And I'm discovering more and more researchers interested to have a concrete impact and trying to make the dive to going one step further and really entering in the discussion about creating and capturing value. Develop clustering and cross-fertilization. The quadruple helix is the priority, and it's working quite well, and we should even keep improving those type of policy. Develop infrastructures, we've talked about it. For such certain type of activities like pharmaceutical and biotech, we need some infrastructures, and we have been successful to develop those infrastructures those last years. Measure the direct and indirect benefit of innovation. Maybe we should need more studies about clear demonstration about the direct benefit, and I mean the direct benefit for the society, not only for the economy, because this is quite limitative, but the direct and indirect benefit of innovation. And then that's maybe a bigger challenge, is to be able to accept that at a certain time we should change something in the society to be able to industrialize and to produce in Belgium. Mitra had the example with the CDMO in Serein. That's an example that should be interesting to consider. What should we do to have the capacity to have very quick production of innovative solution in Belgium instead of seeing the production going elsewhere. This is very quickly and very short, and of course it's a summary of what I wanted to tell you about something probably that it would be interesting to speak 45 minutes about this, but my purpose was also to feed the debate and to launch the question.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And I love that you're challenging our thinking and challenging how we approach the issue. And I think what we've seen is we've gone from a macro discussion now coming to you, Professor Wattenberg, to really challenge us on that more private sector entrepreneurship approach. And I took away a really important message. At one point you said, let grow the tech, and the importance of fostering entrepreneurship on many levels. And you challenged us to think of societal challenges as part of entrepreneurship as well. It's part of our education. It's also important in research, particularly as we think about an aging population and societal elements like pollution. How can we work together to address entrepreneurship and research in these areas? You spoke of the environment for innovation. You spoke to elements that were strong, and you challenged us to think about areas where we can continue to improve. And you mentioned the need to be able to have policies that help pull through the research to go forward. You spoke about the importance of innovation to keep helping society. And you referenced a few great examples of public-private partnerships. You mentioned the Flanders example. You also mentioned Charleroi. And I took away from your messaging also the importance of creating networks for entrepreneurs to come together, for the public and the private sector to come together. It will take networks, not necessarily just one P and another P, but a whole network to come together and pull through the value systems to support the research of the future. So thank you so much for sharing those views with us. And it was a great way to segue now to you, Caroline, in terms of the next lens and point of view around innovation. And please keep the questions coming. I see some coming in, which is wonderful, and we will get right to your questions in a few minutes. But first, allow me to introduce Caroline Venn. She is the CEO of pharma.be, and she's been our CEO since October 2020. She held different management positions in the Blue Cluster, a spearhead cluster for innovation, VKW, Etion, a platform and a think tank for entrepreneurs, and the Federation of Enterprises in Belgium. Mrs. Venn started her career as an economist at the research department of Creditbank, now KBC. From 2008 to 2010, she was chief of staff at the cabinet of Belgian Prime Ministers Yves Le Terme and Herman van Rompuy. She holds a master's degree in applied economics from UFSIA, the University of Antwerp, and a master's in e-business, also from the Antwerp Management School. She is a non-executive board member of bpost and independent director of the Bank van Breda and of Vito, a strategic research organization in the area of clean tech and sustainable development, and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Association of KU Leuven. She has written several books on economics and was, for almost 10 years, one of the resident columnists of Belgian business newspaper De Tijd. Mrs. Venn, Caroline, it's wonderful to have you with us, and the virtual floor is now yours to complete this introductory portion.
Thank you, Brigitte, for your introduction, and thank you also for the previous panelists and for all of you to join this session. In the next 10 minutes, I will explain why innovation is so important for the future, and hence the title, Innovation, the Answer to Everything. And we just learned from previous panelists to almost everything. And the main takeaways are the following. Innovation is not just an invention. It is about turning knowledge into solutions and bringing it to the market so people can benefit from its use. We heard that before. Second takeaway is that innovation has hurdles to overcome. So they can be financial or regulatory, related to market acceptance. So public-private collaboration is key to overcome them. Also, previous panelists have referred to the fact that over the last 60 to 70 years, innovation has more and more become a joint enterprise of public and private collaboration, where lately also the public at large or even NGOs are participating in a triple or quadruple helix. And finally, invention or innovation results in great achievements for society. Next slide, please. So, let me first explain how innovation differs from an invention. And Professor De Backer already referred to the long lead time from research going to innovation. I will go even a bit further in time. Take the example of the steam engine. This invention is considered to be the kickoff of the first industrial revolution. But the steam engine existed already more than 2,000 years ago. On this figure, you see what's called the eolipile. I always have to look at how to pronounce it, which was invented 300 years before Christ by Hieron from Alexandria. This is a steam engine, quite primitive one, that has never been put to any use, but the legend says it was demonstrated as a kind of gimmick to open the door of a temple. But no real activity resulted from this intellectual breakthrough. Next slide. It was James Watt at the end of the 18th century who introduced the steam engine to the market. He improved an existing model using much less energy, so it became economically interesting for use in mills and in mining. And together with Bolton, an entrepreneur who agreed to fund the first test engines, he took patents on his invention and licensed it to engine owners. So they really turned an invention from more than 2000 years ago into a real innovation. Next slide. So to go from an invention to innovation, one needs to cross the so-called valley of death. The invention needs to be scaled, it needs to be to reach a higher technology level, it needs to be introduced to the market, and all this comes at a high cost with uncertain outcome. On this graph, you see how the budget spent by pharmaceutical companies on R&D has exploded over the last 40 years. So the percentage of budget spent on R&D has increased from approximately 10% of total sales in the beginning of the 80s to 20% or even more at present. So the increased investments are not always translated in a similar increase in drugs discovered. You see that also on this graph, be it small molecule drugs or biologic drugs. And this shows the uncertainty of the outcome of the investments. Next slide. And we also see system changes in pharmaceutical innovation. Think of the advent of personalized medicines and of ATMPs, the advanced therapy medicinal products. They are extremely promising. They might lead to potential cures by correcting the underlying cause of their disease, such as a genetic defect. And on a global scale, we see that the number of clinical trials with ATMPs is really increasing fast. It is more than 30% over a 5 years period. But we see this increase especially in North America, also in Asia, but not so in Europe. Reason for this are the regulatory constraints, especially in Europe. Some of the ATMPs, such as gene therapies, consist of GMOs. And on top of complying with existing regulations for clinical trials, one therefore has to comply with the EU legislation on GMOs, a regulation that was drafted for agricultural applications and that does not really fit the pathway that is needed for clinical trials, and it complicates the authorization periods for clinical trials in Europe. But also the reimbursement system is not ready yet for these changes. For most medicines, the current system is based on a reimbursement during the treatment that is spread over time. But with ATMPs, we're facing a reimbursement for a one-time treatment with a high one-off cost. So the combination of high R&D cost, uncertain results, regulatory constraints, and even system changes show the need for good collaboration between the pharmaceutical industry and the public sector. Next slide, please. A lot has changed since Hippocrates, but the health explosion is a matter of only the last 150 years. It was made possible through an intense public-private collaboration, by public authorities putting in place social security systems, but also by investing public funds into research at universities and knowledge institutes, and also by co-investment in industrial R&D. So this public-private collaboration goes hand in hand with the rise of GDP per capita and the life expectancy of citizens. People now have a life expectancy of over 80 years, whereas it has been only around 30 years for ages before the Industrial Revolution. And this shows how important the positive external effects of investing in health system and in pharmaceutical care are. Next slide, please. So the current pandemic is also a clear illustration of this cooperation. The previous panelists have also referred to this. During the COVID crisis, you see that the pharmaceutical industry showed its determination to further invest in R&D to help combating the crises. On this graph, you see the reported nominal R&D expense growth in 2020, so the year of the crisis, for the top R&D investing companies per industry. These industries are the ICT, pharmaceutical, and automobile industry. And one notices that companies in the ICT and pharmaceutical industry kept increasing their R&D efforts, which was not the case in other industries. The increased R&D in the ICT sector also coincides with the COVID crisis. It reflects the need for digital solutions for everything, from a digital meeting, from webinars such as this one, to ordering dinners at home. But the stark increase of R&D spending in the pharmaceutical industry reflects its efforts to find solutions for one of the largest health crises in the last century. And the rise of private spending was matched, especially in the US and the UK, with public funding to allow faster market access and speeding the crossing of the valley of death for vaccines. Next slide. And this public-private collaboration did bring great benefits to society. First of all, of course, for patients. Over the period of 10 years, life expectancy in Belgium increased by almost 2 years, 1.7 years. And most of this increase, a study shows that almost 3/4 of it was due to innovative medicines. What were once deadly diseases, such as HIV or hepatitis C, are now, thanks to new medicines, turned into chronic illnesses. They do not reduce the life expectancy for the patients anymore. Next slide. So the innovative pharmaceutical industry has also led to strong growth and increased prosperity, as shown in our 2020 Pharma report. In Belgium, jobs have increased to over 40,000 persons in our sector, and the number of researchers grew, private researchers grew to over 6,000. And last year, total R&D spending in Belgium went up by 30% to almost 5 billion euro, and exports went up by 13% to over 56 billion euros. So the pharmaceutical industry is one of the only industries in Belgium combining high growth in value added, high growth in employment, and a high productivity growth. So this innovative industry is really crucial to support the Belgian economy and the health of its population. Last slide. This brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope to have demonstrated that innovation is not just an invention, it is about turning knowledge into solution, that innovation should be supported in overcoming hurdles as they emerge, for which public-private collaboration is key. This will result in great achievements for society, both from an economic as from a health aspect. Well, thank you very much and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you for those key summary points. Really turning knowledge into solutions, I think, is a wonderful takeaway. And you helped us understand the evolution of innovation over time. I loved how you painted the future of science to come with ATMPs, with cell and gene therapy, and what it could mean, and the different ways we need to think about how we could work together to make it a reality for patients living in Belgium. And you also highlighted that public-private collaboration has gone up throughout the years as investments in GDP per capita have gone up, and you highlighted those positive effects and the relationship between those investments and then outcomes for those in greatest need, for the patients. And I really appreciated the ROI for society and how you painted that for us with very clear examples in terms of contributions in healthcare and science, but also the economic impact, which was also referenced by Professor Wattenberg as well. So thank you so much for completing that series of perspectives. Now, if you allow me, dear panelists, I'm going to ask you a few questions that have come into the chat and the Q&A function. And I'm going to start with a few macro questions. And one of them is coming about the responsibility. So what is the responsibility of universities and companies to be able to make innovations accessible and available? All of you talked about collaboration and partnership one way or another. So where is the responsibility and how do we make sure it's accessible and available? Professor Goldman, I see your hand up first. And you may be on mute, sir.
This is a very important question. I think that both academia and industry have a huge responsibility. Regarding academia, I think that we have to do much better in terms of allowing our scientists to take risks. And I would like to refer to a report which was recently produced by Reinier Vögelers and others, which clearly demonstrate that also in academia, we should do much better in terms of incentivizing people to move outside their comfort zone, to take risk, and not just to follow, the usual research track. That's one responsibility. The other responsibility, which is related to tech transfer, and it will be interesting to hear Koen about this, but I think that in the terms of technology transfer, universities have a huge responsibility, making sure that once their technology is transferred, it is used in the best way possible to reach and to benefit society. And I always refer to what has happened in the US at the time of HIV, where at some point the government decided that in the tech transfer agreement, there would be provision to make sure that, the technology which is transferred will be further developed and finally will allow to get new products at a reasonable price. So after that, this provision was cancelled for, I think, bad reason. But I think that now is the time for certain indications, such as rare disease that you mentioned, and perhaps also some of the infectious threat, to reflect on this. So in terms of industry, well, as you understand, they have a very important role. I think that in the context of this pandemic, the industry not only claimed that they would consider their role and explain to their shareholders that for this pandemic they have to behave differently, and they did so. We will see if this can stay, on the long term. But I think it's very important, and I would like here to refer to the possibility, at least for some pharmaceuticals, to consider, the benefit corporation concept. We have one company in Belgium. It's not a pharmaceutical company, but it's another company involved in healthcare. It's IBA, which is producing those cyclotrons and other nuclear medicine products. And they have now this benefit corporation certification, which is one way to make sure that indeed, beside the interest of shareholders, company also consider more importantly their societal responsibility. Over.
Thank you very much. Would anybody else like to contribute, Caroline or Professor Wattenberg from the entrepreneur? Yes, sir, your hand is up.
Yes, I'm afraid if I would have had to answer this question 5 or 10 years ago, it would not be the same as the one I will provide you with today. What we see today is that companies are more and more involved in the society, and they take care of the stakeholders. They need to access finance, but also to motivate the engagement of their staff. And today, you know that we are in a battle of talent. So if you want your company to find the right talent, you would not be able to extract too much value. And probably it's still the case in some of the companies, but my point of view is that it will be slightly reduced in the future. So of course the government has this role to play, but I think there will be a natural process to make sure that if there are some game-changing innovation, the best way to spread them, in an affordable way, it's clearly the entrepreneurship and the companies. And on the other hand, we go in the right direction regarding the respect of the planet and the respect of the people, and the taking into consideration the stakeholder. Maybe it's not perceptible by some of the people in the society, but in my daily practice, talking with large companies, they take this into consideration. And if they don't, they one day the one financing those enterprises will remember them this.
Thank you very much. Professor De Backer, your hand is up.
Yes, well, I think it's also interesting to go back in time from time to time. If you go back to 1980 and you look at the Bayh-Dole Act and the Stevenson-Widler Act, which are extremely important acts that, on the one hand, provide universities and a large public research organizations like Lawrence Berkeley and other ones to become proprietor of their intellectual property. But on the other hand, the same acts force them to diligently transfer and exploit that IP. So this means that this is still relevant today. So what happened in the States 40 years ago is really what should be happening today. You are not just entitled to the property rights, but you're also forced to exploit it. And if you combine those two, then I think we are a long way down the road to transfer and diffuse know-how. And I also would like to make a critical remark, because the last couple of months, there have been quite some suggestions in terms of banning intellectual property rights, etc. Honestly, I think it's not because there is a patent that there is a problem. A lot depends on the terms and conditions that happen within the licensing sphere. And a lot happens also in that sphere regarding the way implicit and tacit know-how is mobilized in order to, for instance, produce a vaccine. Because what we have seen today is that the companies that have been most successful in the ecosystem and bringing the vaccines to the market and to the citizen are those companies that had a vaccine production manufacturing capability and competence in-house. The companies that didn't have this all have paid a price to go down the learning or experience curve. So these are a number of issues we should definitely consider before making statements like, for instance, there should be a ban on patents, because this will not solve the problem at all. The problem is in the value chain, and you have to force diligent exploitation in that value chain, and that's the most important one. So I think, and probably pharma.be has an important role to play, to educate not just the sector, because the sector knows, but to educate the broader audience on those fundamental laws of bringing a drug to a patient.
Yeah, thank you so much, Caroline. That's an invitation to you to see if you'd like to add anything else to this conversation about what is the responsibility of universities and companies to work together to make sure innovations are accessible and available.
Well, thank you. I will join what has been said by previous speakers. And sorry, I did not find the hand. And I didn't want to wave to react earlier, but it is an important question. As I mentioned, basic companies are really relying on basic research, on science that is developed within universities. It's not the role of companies to take that over. And this is why tech transfer is so important. But in order to have a system where this tech transfer might not be perceived as, okay, we have invested as a society in knowledge within university, within research institutes, and now we give it away for a proprietary company to only develop it. One thus has tech transfers with licenses, etc., which are paid for by industry. If a company takes a license of research that has been done in a research institute or in a university, it is paid for, and this allows also the universities, the researchers, to have more funds to do more advanced research and to go even further in their basic research. This is a very virtuous, very positive cycle. As to the responsibility of the companies themselves, it has been said a company nowadays cannot afford itself, not in pharma, not in automobile, not in another sector, to ignore the challenges that society is facing. And this is especially true for the pharmaceutical industry, where health of patients, health of population is at the core of our business. So I would say corporate social responsibility is really what is the nature of pharmaceutical industry, but this does not mean, of course, that pharmaceutical companies are not in doing their own R&D, are not asking to be rewarded for that. They have a just price to have when they bring their medicines to the market, in order also to pay for the R&D that has been done and developed, which is not always basic research, but the whole trajectory that is needed to bring a medicine to the market. And IP is indeed also a driver for this final product, because otherwise you might have done, it's sometimes an amount of between 1 and 2 billion euros to bring a product to the market, on top of the research that has already been done by scientists in universities. You need to have payment for that, otherwise it stops. So this is what I wanted to add to what has been said, and I fully agree with the previous speakers.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And there's actually a question that just came in reacting to your dialogue that I'd like to pose to all of you. And you can choose which one would like to address it. But the question has to do with, is a close collaboration between academic institutions and industry not threatening the independent role of universities to do independent research that would serve societal value? So I'm just wondering who might like to kick off with that perspective. Does this collaboration threaten? Yes, Professor De Backer.
Well, honestly, I often hear this statement, but I think it's a bit of a myth, because you have to take into account, just look, and I'm talking Europe now, but the same holds for American universities with large endowments. If you just take the average research budget at the European university, then 85+% of that budget is coming from public means, subsidies, grants, etc., with no industry involvement whatsoever. And all research policy offices and tech transfer offices at all the universities I know see to it that 85% of research is really deployed in a curiosity-driven, meaning independent manner. So if you talk about interaction with industry in terms of budget and scale, it's quite limited. It's important because I come to that in a second, but it's quite limited, which means that there will never be a reach through to the independent research, because research policy offices and tech transfer offices are very alert as to this issue. What is even more important, we see in a lot of research that has been conducted on tech transfer over the last 10-15 years, that there are important cognitive spillovers between being involved with industry and the independent research of the scientists and our professors and principal investigators, because through being exposed to industry, they start understanding where there are problems that need fundamental science to be solved. So rather than hampering independence, I think it's fostering independence, because it fosters independent inquiry on behalf of the researcher. If it would be the reverse, 85% funded by industry and 15% purely independent or ground-based, then it would be a different story. But that's not the story today.
Thank you very much. Professor Goldman, your hand is up.
Yeah, I think that what Professor De Backer described is a bit an ideal situation, which I am afraid doesn't apply to each institution. I think there is a risk, and we should be, aware of this risk. And the risk is also related to the way we operate in academia. You know, when you look at the CV of people you want to recruit or to promote, you look at the patents they own, you look at, the tech transfer activities they facilitate, and obviously some institutions quite significantly depend on the revenues they get from the tech transfer. So there is at least a danger, and we should be conscious of this danger and to make sure that indeed we still incentivize, risky, blue sky research. And again, I think that this report, which was co-authored by Renil Vögelers, is very interesting in this respect.
Very good. Thank you very much. I look to the other two if you want to add. We have a few more questions, so go ahead, Caroline, and then we'll go to the next question.
Yes, just to react on this, that it can also work reverse. Out of time reasons, I left out this slide, but I wanted to show you a slide on perhaps you've ever heard about it, the Grace Horse manure crisis. It was a big crisis on mobility, on ecological reasons, a health crisis, which was somewhere 1895. It had to do with horses being the main means of transportations also in cities. And so there was a big conference held then with politicians, public authorities on how to resolve this ecological and health crisis with all these horses and the manure that was really growing in a unhealthy way. They didn't come up with real solutions, but then 2-3 years later, industry came with a solution. And it was not a kind of genetically modified horse. It was the car that entered the market by Mercedes-Benz. And the car replaced at that moment the horses in cities where lots of the congestion caused and also the ecological and health problems caused by the horses was put aside. Of course, we know that on the moment cars are the new horses and it's the new problem to solve. But just to say that also solutions can come by research done, innovation done from industry and given answers also more to the public domain. I think it's good to have this cooperation and this way of thinking out of the box.
Thank you so much. Thank you for completing that dialogue. Professor Goldman, there's a question specifically directed to you. What do you think the critical actions, public and private actors, are going forward to prevent future pandemics? What are the critical actions?
I think that's a key question, and I will try to answer briefly, but I will also try to answer the next question by Geert van Gassen, because for me, they are linked. I think that we should realize that actually for years, for example, the European Commission launched programs for, preparedness response to pandemic. It started in the early 2000s when there was the SARS-CoV-1 epidemics, mainly in Asia. And basically we failed. And the reason we failed is I think that we didn't take the global approach which is necessary. And to fight pandemic, you have to remember where are those bugs coming from? They come from animals, and why they finally reach us is because of environmental issues. And I think that what we have to do, and it's a very important responsibility, is really to pay much more attention. There's been a recent paper in Nature or Science on the importance of, climate change, pollution, environment in driving the emergence of pandemic. And I think this is really essential. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much for that. And a little question tagged in. I don't know if you'd like to address that quickly. Didn't the COVID pandemic show us the importance of production capacity being stronger than putting efforts into R&D? Would you like to address that, Professor Goldman? And then I look to others as well.
Yeah, with pleasure, although I think that there are other experts in the panel which might be in a better position. But I think it's not one or the other. I think the fact that we are so dependent on others to produce, and it's not only China and Asia, we are dependent on the US also for some basic ingredients of vaccine. And I think that the Commissioner Breton made it really right. I think this should be a priority for the future. But I think that it's not one or the other. I think we still have to put a lot of effort in R&D to make sure. There was also a question of brain drain. I think, there is a problem there, so that the best scientists who become entrepreneurs don't have to go elsewhere, essentially in the US, to continue their efforts and to become entrepreneur. And I can give you several examples of this.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Wattenberg, your hand went up very quickly afterwards.
Oh, yes, I do agree with Professor Goldman. We should not opt for one innovation on one side or production on the other side. Every 2 years, we produce at EY the megatrends. And one of the megatrends already, that we got some weak signal in 2018, but it was clear in 2020, is that we will come with a larger and larger confrontation between nations, and we will see some types of cybersecurity issue driven by status, and we will see some protectionism. So the logics in the next years will be more continental than global. So in this case, we have to learn. We have to first of all be able to produce and make an extensive use of the new technology, Industry 4.0, additive manufacturing, everything that can enable today to have smaller production units to launch third batch, but also to learn from the production and to have a loop that can help us also improving the innovative solution. So I think there is a common agreement today that production is becoming not yet as important, but more and more important, and that we have to come up with a technology solution and probably also political solution. Today, it's quite difficult in Flanders with the limited territories to create factories, and it's becoming more and more difficult in the other regions to have the permits. So probably that we have to accept that in the futures, we should have another modern production units that could be quickly implemented, and that the society must be adapted to this challenge.
Thank you. Caroline.
Very brief reaction. Yes, R&D is needed. The vaccines for COVID-19 were not on the shelf. They did need further investment in R&D, in development to reach population. That's first remark. But second, indeed, there's also a production effort to do. Just to give a figure, until now, the annual production capacity for vaccines for other diseases worldwide was 5 billion doses. Now, on top of this, we need to have a capacity of more than 10 billion doses, and the world needs it today. Just to give you an example of how big, or figure how big this effort indeed is. And this is also the reason why not today whole the world has already these vaccines. It's impossible to scale it up to that extent, but industry is doing everything it can, also in collaboration with others to get to that goal. And we hope it will be the case by next year.
Thank you so much. Professor De Backer.
Well, I also think it's not an or, but it's an and story, because the vaccine development has shown how important science really is. But I would like to summarize it in 3 words. So we need invention, and for invention, I look to science. And luckily, Europe has been investing quite substantially in science at the level of European Commission and at the level of the different European countries. So that's a good thing. Second is the issue of production. And production also means proper incentives. And proper incentives are very often related to how can you maintain a competitive production environment in Europe. And this has nothing to do with lots of subsidies. This has not much to do with R&D. This has a lot to do with making sure that companies can attract the talent they need in production, that this talent is affordable, etc., etc. And Europe has a way to go there. And then the third word I would like to mention is action. It's interesting to see that a couple of years ago, I think in 2017 or 18, there was a report published by the Johns Hopkins University on what would happen if we would have a pandemic in the period 2025-2028. So people were busy building scenarios on such a possibility only, none of our policy makers really took it very seriously. And I think that's a third thing, action, policy action, related to foresight, related to understanding what might happen if such a thing occurs. So for me, it's invention, and we did this well. It's production, we can do it better. And it's action when being forward-looking. And there, I think there has been also some shortage in what has happened over the last 5 years.
It's a perfect way to summarize that question. Perfect way to summarize the end of this session. It has gone by so quickly. There is one question left, and perhaps we'll follow up individually with that question. It is about how we can help explain and really fight disinformation and misinformation that is out there. And I think this panel and this conversation today is one way that we can help really to bring clarity, to bring debate and discussion, and to create these learning situations. So thank you to all 4 of you for being with us today. It's been a wonderful learning opportunity. The 90 minutes went by so quickly. And I think you have some wonderful thoughts that you've shared with us today about the importance of science as a key ingredient in healthcare, about science being the foundation to translate improvements and innovation into society and into our economy. You spoke of the importance of entrepreneurship, underpinning partnerships, and the responsibility we have as partners as a foundation for innovation going forward. And all of you spoke of the importance of public-private partnerships, not only the traditional public and private, but also all of the other actors in an ecosystem that you described, and the importance of civil society. So if we take away any message, what I heard is the future of science is exciting. It is about translating that science and making it available to those in need. It is about the right collaboration and mix of policies that will help it flourish. And it's by working together that we'll have even greater health and greater economic wealth in Belgium. So thank you to all of you, to the participants. Please fill out the poll and the survey that you see right in front of you. It would really help us into the future, and it will help us understand what future topics we can tackle as we go. And in the meantime, we wish you all a wonderful evening ahead, and thank you for being with us.